Okay, here we are with part 3, restrictions on competition. What this is specifically discussing is government restrictions on competition and the role of government in restricting competition. First things first, ambivalence of policies. The government's policies are, remember who our government is made up of. Typically, people who are elected to office are lawyers who spent their lives studying the law and then campaigning for public office. These are people without business, for the most part, without business training, without practical training, without economic training. They're wrapped up in in having power and the idiosyncrasies of the law, and they often miss the most obvious things. Most of the time, they have the best of intentions, but they often forget that their policies are ambivalent and that they have a lot of unintended consequences. And the example I'm going to use here is cash for clunkers. Now, I can go on and on about cash for clunkers, but I'm going to try and keep it brief. What happened was that if you had, for those of you that don't remember, if you had an older car that didn't get very good mileage, you could turn it in, go to a car dealer and say, hey, I want that new Ford Mustang and here's my clunker. The Mustang dealer would say, okay, you have $5,000 towards a purchase of the new Mustang. Or I think that was the correct amount. And then the government would give the Mustang dealership back the $5,000. And so it was a government subsidized program. And the idea was pure in its intent. It was just very poorly thought through because they didn't consider the ramifications of the policy. So people who had cars could then go in and get an obscene amount of money for their used car that wasn't worth very much, and to begin with, and it may have even been more than $5,000, and get towards a new car and get a new car that gets better mileage and will perform better and is better for the environment, and we get the economy moving because we're buying new cars and making purchases, and it was very expensive for the government, and people took advantage because they're getting all the money that the government set aside for cash for clunkers was used, because if you give people more than their car is worth, they're going to take it. But what was the negative side of this? Well, let me give you an example. I had around that time I had an old pickup. Actually, I'm going to use my old Suburban as a better example. My old Suburban, it qualified for cash for clunkers. It was older. It got bad mileage. Wasn't worth hardly anything. I mean, it was worth a couple $1,000s at the most. If I had taken it in for cash for clunkers, they would have given me a lot of money for this car. I could have bought something new, and it would have counted as a down payment on something new. And then they would have taken, part of the deal was that any car that was bought with government money was then crushed, because they wanted those cars that get poor mileage, gas guzzlers, and are bad for the environment, supposedly, off the roads. Well, what happens is that the used car market was impacted negatively to an extreme degree, because now that Suburban is no longer in existence. So because there's so many fewer cars for the used market, the lower income folks that can't afford cash for clunkers couldn't afford the payments on a new car regardless of getting the extra money from the government. It just doesn't affect them. They aren't playing in that ballpark. Those folks now have to pay more for used cars because the supply of used cars was greatly decreased. And so the prices of used cars went up as a result of cash for clunkers. So who did it end up hurting? It ended up hurting the lower income folks. And who did it end up helping? Owners of car dealerships, the rich. Okay? So government policy that was supposed to help the poor and the lower income people get cars actually just helped the rich get richer in all reality, and the middle class turned in their cars to get better cars. The lower income folks who this was created to help really ended up on the short end, because now there's no lower income family that could have paid $1,500, $2,000 for that old Suburban that was still running just fine. That's no longer an option for them. That car doesn't exist anymore after cash for clunkers. So it really had some unintended consequences, and that's why you haven't seen it continue and why it was cut off. And there's a little bit of news coverage about the negative side, but it really went poorly. Next, for the sake of time, we'll move on. I could talk about that all day. Selling below cost. Selling below cost is illegal in most states because they want to create competition, and they think if a big company can sell below cost to crush a little company, that's not fair. And they want to make things fair. The reality is that almost never really happens. It's an unrealistic situation, and the result isn't automatically that the small company is going to go out of business. For example, if I'm a book publisher, I'm a small-time book publisher, and there's a big book publisher out there, one of the big ones, and I start coming out with books at a pretty good price, and I'm taking some of their customers. Some of their good authors are now writing through me. I'm publishing their books at a good price. The big guy says, hey, we want Stephen King back. We want Tom Clancy or whoever. We want them back in our stable of writers. And this guy's stolen them. So we're going to drop the price of our books. And to the point where it's below our cost, he won't be able to compete and he'll go out of business. And the government has passed laws preventing that. The issue is that doesn't really happen. It doesn't work that way. Because what would happen if I was a little bookseller and there was some big guy that dropped his prices a whole bunch? First, I may drop my prices a little, but say, hey, I've still got a good product. People are going to buy it, even if he's a little bit cheaper. And when he drops his prices, his sales are going to go way up. And so it's not as if if he drops his price below cost and he's losing 50 cents a book, it's not as if, and he's been selling 1 million books, it's not as if he's going to be losing $500,000. He's going to go from selling 1 million books to 2 million books because, remember, as price goes down, demand goes up, and he's going to end up losing $1 million. So it's very costly to drop below cost because of the supply and demand issue. The other thing is I'm going to cut my costs. I'm going to say, okay, he's dropping his prices. I'm going to drop mine to be competitive. I'm going to use cheaper paper. I'm going to use less colors on my cover. I'm going to pay my writers a little bit less up front and defer the payment till later. I'm going to play with things to try and stay in business. I'm going to fight this guy, and he won't be able to sustain those losses for too long before he finally says it's not worth it. I'm not taking enough sales away from him to make this fight worth it. So the book kind of gets into that a little bit, that selling below cost, not really a very realistic situation because business people understand this and they don't really do it too often, and when they do it, it fails. So it's not really an issue, but it's something that lawmakers say, well, it sounds like it's a bad thing. Let's not think it through and just pass a law. Well, it's not really a law protecting anybody from anything because it just is a very rare occurrence. All right, I'm going to divide this in half, so we'll stop there and pick it up with part 4.